Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Tech. You are safe here, and you are in the right place. Have you ever wondered what the world was like before screens and constant notifications? Tonight, we journey back to a quieter time and learn how the internet that we all use in our everyday lives came to be. Close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and prepare to drift and transport yourself into the gentle history of the internet. This is not a hurried documentary, and it is not a race to cover history as quickly as possible. Instead, this is a gentle telling, a story meant to unfold slowly, with calmness, with patience, so that you may listen, learn about the technology around us, and perhaps drift into rest. As you listen to this story tonight, you may notice your breathing slowing. You may feel your body grow heavy. You may drift in and out of attention. That is not a problem. That is welcome. Now relax as you listen to the story of how the internet we now use daily came to be. The internet, that invisible web of connections we now take for granted, has not always been with us. There was a time before constant notifications, before search engines, before glowing screens in every pocket. In that earlier time, communication was slower, heavier, more deliberate. Messages moved at the pace of letters and telegraphs. Conversations paused with the distance between phone calls, and knowledge waited quietly in drawers and libraries until someone sought it out. The story of the internet is the story of how people learned to share information faster, to reach across oceans in moments instead of months, to carry entire libraries on a single wire, and eventually to bring the whole world into a network of constant conversation. But this did not happen suddenly. It did not appear fully formed. It was not a single invention nor a single genius who made it real. It was the result of many steps taken by researchers, engineers, students, and dreamers. Some worked with government funding, some tinkered in university labs, and others contributed quietly through experiments and trials that did not seem historic at the time. Each step, each contribution added a layer. Protocols, machines, codes, and habits, all of them blending together into what would eventually become the internet. It is important to remember this because the internet today feels overwhelming, even infinite. But it began small, fragile, uncertain. And the people who built it could not have predicted the vast network we now know. The internet itself was not built in a day. It was built patiently, over decades, with pauses, with setbacks, with long stretches of quiet progress. Your listening may mirror that same rhythm. You may miss a detail here and there, and still find the story intact when you return. So let us begin our journey. Our story will take us from those quiet beginnings to the rise of giant machines, to the spark of ARPANET in the 1960s, to the creation of packet switching and TCP/IP, and finally, to the web, to the boom, and to the bust of the dot-com era. But for now, we begin gently, with an invitation to listen, an invitation to rest, and an invitation to follow, at a slow pace, the remarkable path of how the Internet came to be.
Imagine, for a moment, a world without screens. No glowing icons, a lack of buzzing notifications through your phone screen, and information accessible only through books and libraries. This was the world for most of human history. Even just a few generations ago, life unfolded at a slower rhythm. Messages traveled not by fiber optics or satellites, but by horses, ships, wires, and voices carried through copper lines. To share a thought across distance was not a casual gesture, but an effort, sometimes an ordeal. For centuries, the letter was humanity's most common form of long-distance communication. To write one was an act of patience. You dipped a pen into ink or tapped on the heavy keys of a typewriter. Your words lived on a page, folded carefully, sealed and stamped. And then you waited. Maybe your message would reach its recipient in a week, maybe in a month. If the seas were stormy or the trains delayed, it might take longer. A conversation stretched across weeks could last a year. Entire business, political, and even romantic relationships were carried by these patient exchanges. The American Revolution itself was planned and debated by letters that took months to cross the Atlantic. By the time a message reached London from the colonies, the situation it described might already have changed. Communication was not instant. It was slow, deliberate, and deeply tied to the rhythms of the physical world. Then, in the 19th century, came the first great leap, the telegraph. Invented in the 1830s and commercialized by Samuel Morse and others, it reduced vast distances to mere seconds. For the first time, words could be translated into dots and dashes, carried as pulses of electricity through copper wires. It was as if thought itself could travel down a line. News of wars, elections, and financial markets no longer took weeks, it took minutes. The Crimean War in the 1850s was the first conflict where the world followed battles in near real time, because journalists could telegraph reports across Europe. But telegraphs were expensive. They charged by the word. Messages were short, clipped, and urgent. Births, deaths, and deals were squeezed into the briefest possible form. Every syllable mattered. Still, the telegraph taught humanity a new lesson. Communication could be fast. It did not need to crawl across oceans. It could leap. Soon after, in the late 19th century, the telephone arrived. For the first time, a person's voice could cross wires. Alexander Graham Bell's 1876 call, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," marked the beginning of voice communication over distance. Imagine the wonder to hear another person's voice without being in the same room. Families who once waited for weeks to read letters could suddenly talk instantly. Businesses could negotiate contracts without couriers. At first, the technology was clumsy. Calls were connected manually by operators pulling plugs on switchboards. A long-distance call required careful routing through multiple exchanges. And it was expensive. A single call across states might cost more than a family earned in a week. Long distance was reserved for special occasions, birthdays, deaths, or urgent business. But the telephone carried something the telegraph never could: tone, laughter, emotion, the human voice itself. It brought people closer in a way no letter ever could. But communication was not the only challenge. Knowledge itself was slow. If you wanted to learn something, a fact, a formula, a law, you did not search for it. You traveled to a library. You pulled out wooden drawers of index cards, flipping through typed entries. Each slip of paper was a signpost, pointing you toward a book, a journal, a document. You walked aisles of shelves. You lifted heavy volumes through the corridors, sometimes centuries old, with worn-out covers and pages. It was a ritual of patience. A discovery might take hours. Sometimes the book you needed was already checked out. Sometimes it existed only in another city. Scholars wrote letters requesting articles from overseas. Journals traveled by ship and train. A scientist in London might wait months to read the latest American research. Collaboration across countries was slowed not by lack of interest, but by lack of speed. By the mid-20th century, this slowness was becoming a problem. Science was advancing rapidly. Computers were emerging in government labs and universities. But these computers were islands, giant humming machines that could not talk to one another. To share results, researchers still mailed punch cards and tapes. A program written at MIT could not easily run in California without being shipped there physically. And all the while, the world was tense. The Cold War loomed large. Governments worried that in the event of war, communication lines, phone exchanges, command centers might be destroyed. How could information survive? How could messages get through even if part of the network was gone? It was in this climate that the seeds of the internet were planted. The slow world of letters and libraries, the clipped efficiency of telegrams, the miraculous intimacy of telephones, all of it formed the backdrop for a new dream. What if machines could talk? What if information could move as fast as thought, resilient against disaster, available to anyone who needed it? Science fiction writers of the 40s and 50s imagined planetary networks of computers, but in labs and offices, the reality lagged behind. The technology was not ready. Still, the vision was there. The dream of a fast and flexible connection to others around the globe was waiting. And so, as the 1960s approached, researchers began to design something new. Something that could outpace mailrooms, but was more flexible than commonly used telegraphs. Something cheaper than long-distance phone calls, yet more accessible than library shelves. The world was ready for a new kind of network. And in that readiness, the first sparks of the internet began to glow.
Imagine stepping into a research laboratory in the late 1940s. The air is heavy with the warmth of glowing vacuum tubes, and the steady whir of cooling fans fills the room. Tall panels lined with switches and dials stand in rows, each one buzzing softly with life. At the center of the room sits a machine that dwarfs its operators, not sleek, not compact, and certainly not personal. This was the dawn of electronic computing, and these machines were giants. One of the first was ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. Completed in 1945 at the University of Pennsylvania, it marked the transition from human calculation to automated computation. ENIAC was designed not for entertainment or business spreadsheets, but for war. Its primary task was to calculate artillery trajectories for the U.S. Army, a job that had previously relied on teams of human computers, many of them women, who worked tirelessly with paper, pencils, and mechanical calculators. That system was slow, exhausting, and error-prone. ENIAC changed the pace entirely. With over 17,000 vacuum tubes and weighing nearly 30 tons, it could perform calculations thousands of times faster than any human team. The price of that speed, however, was fragility. If a single tube failed, which they often did, the entire machine could grind to a halt, forcing engineers to roam the aisles with clipboards, replacing components and restarting the process. ENIAC's successor, UNIVAC, the Universal Automatic Computer, shifted the conversation from pure research and military applications to the world of government and business. Delivered in the early 1950s, UNIVAC earned fame in 1952 when it predicted Dwight Eisenhower's presidential victory live on national television, long before human pollsters trusted the result. That moment captured the public's imagination. For the first time, ordinary people saw a computer not as a mysterious laboratory device, but as a machine that could shape society itself. Yet UNIVAC remained out of reach for the public. Its price tag was in the millions. Its operation required teams of programmers and engineers, and its physical presence filled entire rooms. For most people, computers were still something you only read about in newspapers. Programming these machines was a physical craft. Instead of a keyboard and screen, operators fed in instructions on punch cards, stiff pieces of cardboard with tiny rectangular holes punched into them. Each hole represented a command or a piece of data. Drop a stack of cards, and hours of work scattered across the floor. Misplace one, and the entire program could fail. Magnetic tape spun to store programs and results, while teletypes clattered out long streams of output on paper. The experience was noisy, rigid, and unforgiving, yet also deeply ritualistic. Around these mainframes, a culture began to form. Operators managed the machines like caretakers, starting them up with careful checklists and shutting them down with equal precision. Programmers developed new languages such as Fortran, tailored for scientific work, and COBOL, designed for business applications. Universities gave students limited time on their machines, often forcing them to book hours late at night when the computers were free. Some institutions ran their machines like tightly scheduled railways, while others fostered experimental environments where students could test bold ideas in the middle of the night. Despite these differences, one thing was common everywhere. The computing community was strictly local. Collaboration stopped at the walls of the building. If you wanted to share results beyond those walls, you relied on postal mail, published journals, or conferences. The isolation was both natural and frustrating. Mainframes were powerful, capable of simulating physics experiments, tabulating census results, or processing payrolls, but they remained islands. Each one stood alone, humming in its sealed room. If a researcher at MIT wanted to compare results with a colleague at Stanford, the process took weeks. Printouts were mailed across the country, or magnetic tapes were shipped by courier. By the time results arrived, they were often outdated. Science was accelerating, and disciplines like physics and engineering demanded collaboration faster than the existing methods could provide. It was during the early 1960s that a partial solution emerged: time-sharing. Rather than allowing one person to monopolize the entire computer, terminals were connected to the mainframe, enabling multiple users to interact with the machine at once. The system quickly switched between tasks, creating the illusion that each user had their own private computer session. For students and researchers, this was revolutionary. While the machine was still centralized, time-sharing offered a glimpse of the future, computing as a resource to be shared widely, not hoarded by a single operator. But as soon as time-sharing spread, another question became impossible to ignore. What if the machines themselves could be linked? Could a program written at one university run on a computer across the country? Could data flow through telephone wires instead of envelopes and couriers? The challenges were formidable. Each computer system had its own architecture and spoke its own language. Even the telephone network, which seemed like a natural solution, was built to carry continuous voices, not bursts of digital data. And yet the pressure to connect grew stronger. Governments needed resilient communication in a world shadowed by the Cold War. Businesses sought efficiency and automation. Scientists craved collaboration. Out of these needs, the dream of networking, of creating bridges between those isolated islands of computing power, began to take shape. The age of mainframes revealed both the promise and the limits of machines. They showed what computers could accomplish on their own, but also exposed what they could not do without connection. By the end of this era, the stage was set. The giants of the mainframe age had proven their worth. Now they awaited the next step, not merely calculating, but communicating.
Imagine stepping into a research laboratory in the late 1940s. The air is heavy with the warmth of glowing vacuum tubes, and the steady whir of cooling fans fills the room. Tall panels lined with switches and dials stand in rows, each one buzzing softly with life. At the center of the room sits a machine that dwarfs its operators. Not sleek, not compact, and certainly not personal. This was the dawn of electronic computing, and these machines were giants. One of the first was ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. Completed in 1945 at the University of Pennsylvania, it marked the transition from human calculation to automated computation. ENIAC was designed not for entertainment or business spreadsheets, but for war. Its primary task was to calculate artillery trajectories for the U.S. Army, a job that had previously relied on teams of human computers, many of them women, who worked tirelessly with paper, pencils, and mechanical calculators. That system was slow, exhausting, and error-prone. ENIAC changed the pace entirely. With over 17,000 vacuum tubes and weighing nearly 30 tons, it could perform calculations thousands of times faster than any human team. The price of that speed, however, was fragility. If a single tube failed, which they often did, the entire machine could grind to a halt, forcing engineers to roam the aisles with clipboards, replacing components and restarting the process. ENIAC's successor, UNIVAC, the Universal Automatic Computer, shifted the conversation from pure research and military applications to the world of government and business. Delivered in the early 1950s, UNIVAC earned fame in 1952 when it predicted Dwight Eisenhower's presidential victory live on national television, long before human pollsters trusted the result. That moment captured the public's imagination. For the first time, ordinary people saw a computer not as a mysterious laboratory device, but as a machine that could shape society itself. Yet, UNIVAC remained out of reach for the public. Its price tag was in the millions. Its operation required teams of programmers and engineers, and its physical presence filled entire rooms. For most people, computers were still something you only read about in newspapers. Programming these machines was a physical craft. Instead of a keyboard and screen, operators fed in instructions on punch cards, stiff pieces of cardboard with tiny rectangular holes punched into them. Each hole represented a command or a piece of data. Drop a stack of cards, and hours of work scattered across the floor. Misplace one, and the entire program could fail. Magnetic tapes spun to store programs and results, while teletypes clattered out long streams of output on paper. The experience was noisy, rigid, and unforgiving, yet also deeply ritualistic. Around these mainframes, a culture began to form. Operators managed the machines like caretakers, starting them up with careful checklists and shutting them down with equal precision. Programmers developed new languages such as Fortran and COBOL, designed for scientific work and business applications. Universities gave students limited time on their machines, often forcing them to book hours late at night when the computers were free. Some institutions ran their machines like tightly scheduled railways, while others fostered experimental environments where students could test bold ideas in the middle of the night. Despite these differences, one thing was common everywhere. The computing community was strictly local. Collaboration stopped at the walls of the building. If you wanted to share results beyond those walls, you relied on postal mail, published journals, or conferences. The isolation was both natural and frustrating. Mainframes were powerful, capable of simulating physics experiments, tabulating census results, or processing payrolls, but they remained islands. Each one stood alone, humming in its sealed room. If a researcher at MIT wanted to compare results with a colleague at Stanford, the process took weeks. Printouts were mailed across the country, or magnetic tapes were shipped by courier. By the time results arrived, they were often outdated. Science was accelerating, and disciplines like physics and engineering demanded collaboration faster than the existing methods could provide. It was during the early 1960s that a partial solution emerged: time sharing. Rather than allowing one person to monopolize the entire computer, terminals were connected to the mainframe, enabling multiple users to interact with the machine at once. The system quickly switched between tasks, creating the illusion that each user had their own private computer session. For students and researchers, this was revolutionary. While the machine was still centralized, time-sharing offered a glimpse of the future. Computing as a resource to be shared widely, not hoarded by a single operator. But as soon as time-sharing spread, another question became impossible to ignore. What if the machines themselves could be linked? Could a program written at one university run on a computer across the country? Could data flow through telephone wires instead of envelopes and couriers? The challenges were formidable. Every computer system had its own architecture and spoke its own language. Even the telephone network, which seemed like a natural solution, was built to carry continuous voices, not bursts of digital data. And yet, the pressure to connect grew stronger. Governments needed resilient communication in a world shadowed by the Cold War. Businesses sought efficiency and automation. Scientists craved collaboration. Out of these needs, the dream of networking, of creating bridges between those isolated islands of computing power, began to take shape. The age of mainframes revealed both the promise and the limits of machines. They showed what computers could accomplish on their own, but also exposed what they could not do without connection. By the end of this era, the stage was set. The giants of the mainframe age had proven their worth. Now, they awaited the next step, not merely calculating, but communicating.
By the mid-1970s, ARPANET was alive. Its humming machines linked universities and research centers, and the first fragile connections had proven themselves reliable. Students sent files across the country. Researchers exchanged data in minutes instead of weeks, and the dream of computer networking was no longer just theory. But even as ARPANET thrived, new networks were beginning to appear. Each one had been built for different reasons, with different designs, and their own rules for how data should move. In France, the Cyclades project experimented with novel ideas about packet transmission. In Britain, the National Physical Laboratory pursued its own network. Across the United States, telecommunications companies promoted their X25 systems. Each was powerful in its own way, but none could speak to the others. The world was building not one network, but many. Each stood as its own island, impressive, but alone. And so a new question arose. How could these separate islands be joined? How could there be not just many networks, but a network of networks? In 1973, two men began to imagine the answer. Robert Kahn, working with ARPA, and Vinton Cerf, a professor at Stanford, sketched out a design that would allow any network, no matter what its structure, to connect with any other. They called it the Internetwork, and its key would be a universal language understood by all. That language became known as TCP, the Transmission Control Protocol. Its design was both simple and revolutionary. Instead of sending a message as one long stream, the message would be broken into smaller pieces, called packets. Each packet carried its own address. Each one could travel separately, finding its own path across the network. When they arrived at their destination, they could be reassembled in the right order. This method brought resilience. If one packet was lost, another could be resent. If one route was blocked, another path could be chosen. Communication could continue even when the network was disrupted.
It was as though a letter had been divided into dozens of postcards, each sent by a different route, yet all arriving to be laid out in sequence, restoring the message to its original form. As the design matured, it became clear that two layers were needed. One layer would handle the delivery of packets, ensuring they reached the right address. This became IP, the Internet Protocol. The other layer would make sure the packets were ordered correctly and arrived whole. That remained TCP. Together, TCP and IP formed a pair. One moved the data, the other made it trustworthy. And most importantly, this system did not care what kind of network carried the packets. Whether by ARPANET's lines, a satellite link, a local Ethernet cable, or a packet radio connection, TCP/IP could travel on top of it. The first great demonstration came in 1977. A van in California was fitted with a mobile packet radio network. That van connected to ARPANET, which in turn connected to a satellite link stretching across the Atlantic. 3 networks, completely different in design, passed data as though they were one. The experiment was quiet, witnessed by only a few, but in hindsight, it was a turning point. The internetwork was real. By the early 1980s, ARPANET had grown too large to maintain multiple protocols. A choice had to be made. The decision was bold. The entire network would switch, all at once, to TCP/IP. The date was set, January 1st, 1983. That morning, every computer connected to ARPANET was required to speak the new language. The older systems were turned off. If something went wrong, the network itself could have collapsed. But the transition succeeded. From that day onward, ARPANET spoke TCP/IP, and with that success, the modern Internet was born. New challenges emerged quickly. Every computer still identified itself by a string of numbers, addresses like 128.32.0.9 or 18.72.0.3, useful for machines but impossible for people to remember. In 1984, Paul Makapetris introduced the Domain Name System, or DNS. With DNS, names could replace numbers. A computer could now be reached at MIT.edu, or Stanford.edu, or UCLA.edu. Behind the scenes, DNS quietly translated the names back into numbers. For the first time, the network felt approachable, almost human. Beyond ARPANET, other networks were joining in. CSNet linked computer science departments across the United States. BitNet, short for Because It's Time, spread email and messaging between universities. Each of them adopted TCP/IP, slowly knitting together into the same fabric. By the mid-1980s, the word Internet had moved from concept to reality. It was no longer just ARPANET, no longer just one experiment. It was becoming a global network of networks, bound together by a shared language. And during this period, one application rose above all others: email. What had begun as Ray Tomlinson's quiet experiment was now the lifeblood of the Internet. By 1973, it already dominated traffic, and in the 1980s, it became indispensable. Researchers used it, businesses adopted it, government agencies depended on it. Mailing lists flourished, connecting communities of scientists, hobbyists, and enthusiasts. The once rare @ symbol became iconic. Through all this growth, one tradition kept the Internet open. The requests for comments, RFCs, where new ideas were proposed, debated, refined, and published for all to see. Anyone could contribute. No single company or government controlled the rules. The culture of openness and collaboration, born in the ARPANET era, carried forward into the Internet's DNA. By the end of the 1980s, the pieces were in place. ARPANET had shown that networking was possible. TCP/IP had united the scattered systems. DNS had made them usable for humans, and email had proven the value of everyday communication. The Internet was no longer a fragile experiment. It was alive, resilient, and growing. Few outside universities and laboratories even knew it existed. But just beyond the horizon, another transformation was waiting: the World Wide Web, ready to bring the Internet into ordinary homes and into daily life. ARPANET's role, though a small and emerging technology during the 1970s, cannot be understated. Still small, still fragile, but working. Computers could pass data across long distances. Researchers could log in remotely, and files could move through the wires. The foundation had been laid. But foundations alone do not capture imagination. What gave the network its meaning were the tools that people built on top of it. The first of these tools would change habits forever. In 1971, at BBN in Massachusetts, a programmer named Ray Tomlinson was experimenting with ways for users on the same computer to leave notes for one another. It was a small convenience, nothing revolutionary. But Tomlinson wondered, what if a message could leap from one computer to another? What if a researcher in Boston could leave a note for a colleague in California instantly? So he modified his program. He created a way for messages to be addressed not just to a person, but to a person at a specific machine. To separate the name of the user from the name of the host, he chose a symbol that was rarely used at the time, the @ With that simple decision, the modern email address was born. At first, email was treated as an experiment, a way to coordinate work. But almost immediately, it became indispensable. By 1973, it accounted for the majority of traffic on ARPANET. It was easier than calling, faster than mailing, and less disruptive than meetings. Researchers found themselves checking their terminals each morning, waiting for new messages. Soon, email was not just a convenience, it was a habit. Imagine the wonder of it in those days, typing a short message into a terminal, pressing return, and knowing that within minutes, someone hundreds or even thousands of miles away could read it. No couriers, no stamps, no waiting. Just words, transformed into pulses of electricity, arriving almost instantly. For many, this was the first taste of something entirely new, communication at the speed of thought. But email was only the beginning. In that same year, another tool appeared, the File Transfer Protocol, or FTP. Researchers needed ways to share programs, datasets, and documents. Carrying magnetic tapes by mail was slow and clumsy. Retyping code from paper listings was tedious and error-prone. FTP allowed a user at one site to copy files directly from another computer across the network. It created the feeling of shared storage. A program written in one lab could be accessed in another. A paper prepared at one university could be retrieved by colleagues far away. For the first time, software itself could be distributed electronically, spreading from place to place at the speed of the network. Over time, FTP servers became communal libraries filled with code, papers, and datasets. What today we call downloading had quietly been born. Alongside FTP came another tool, Telnet. With it, a researcher could sit at a terminal in one building and log directly into a computer hundreds of miles away. The screen in front of you became a window into a distant machine. Your keyboard, connected by the network, could control software that wasn't installed locally. Your eyes could scan data that lived in another city. This changed everything. It meant researchers no longer had to physically travel to use specialized software or access distant data. Collaboration could happen in real time, across distance, through nothing more than wires and code. As these tools spread, something unexpected happened. The network, once imagined as a system for resource sharing, began to feel like a social space. Mailing lists appeared, group addresses where messages were distributed to many people at once. Discussions ranged from programming and new protocols to hobbies and lighthearted jokes. For the first time, communities were forming inside the network. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Usenet took this even further. Unlike ARPANET, Usenet did not require government contracts or official ties. It used dial-up phone lines to pass messages between universities and individuals. On Usenet, conversations were organized into news groups, forums dedicated to endless topics. Students, hobbyists, researchers, and curious newcomers all joined in. They asked questions, debated ideas, argued passionately, and sometimes simply laughed together. It was messy, lively, and unmistakably human. For many, Usenet was their first experience of a global community, scattered across geography, but united by conversation. As communities grew, so did the need for etiquette. Inboxes filled quickly. Reply chains tangled into confusion. Some wrote long, wandering essays. Others answered in single lines. From these early experiences, the idea of netiquette emerged, a shared sense of how to behave online. Be clear, be polite, trim your replies. Remember there is a person on the other side of the screen. The network was also beginning to show its challenges. Spam, unwanted mass messages made an early appearance. Technical glitches caused frustration. Not everyone agreed on the direction the systems should evolve. Yet the overall spirit remained one of openness. Problems were discussed in public. Solutions were shared freely. And the community moved forward together. Looking back, it is striking how much of the modern internet was foreshadowed in these early years. Email became the backbone of communication, eventually used by billions. FTP's file sharing anticipated today's cloud storage and software distribution. Telnet hinted at remote computing, which would later become central to cloud services. And Usenet's news groups predicted the rise of forums, social networks, and comment sections. In the 1970s and early 1980s, these tools were still the province of a small community. Yet within them lay the DNA of what the internet would become. They showed that once people had access to fast, flexible communication, they would find new and unexpected ways to use it, ways the designers had never imagined, ways that revealed that beneath the cables and protocols, the Internet was, at its heart, about people. People sharing their thoughts, people exchanging files, people building communities, people arguing, joking, teaching, and learning. The machines provided the infrastructure, but it was the human activity layered on top that gave the network life. By the end of this chapter of history, the Internet was no longer only a system for computers to talk. It had become a place where people could meet, connect, and form communities that stretched across the world.
By the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, computers were no longer confined to vast government labs or university research centers. Something quieter, but just as revolutionary, was underway. Electronics were shrinking, processors were becoming cheaper, and suddenly, the idea of a personal computer, a machine for the individual, no longer seemed impossible. Machines like the Apple II, the IBM PC, and the Commodore 64 began to appear. They were still costly by the standards of the day, but for the first time, they were within reach for small businesses, schools, and even some households. For decades, computers had been the tools of institutions, large, expensive, and impersonal. Now, for the first time, they could sit on a desk, in a classroom, or even in a bedroom. The personal computer, the PC, was a different kind of machine. It did not fill a room. It did not require teams of engineers to operate. It plugged into a household outlet, and though far less powerful than the giant mainframes, it carried something far more important: accessibility. Students could type essays on word processors. Families could balance household budgets with spreadsheets. Children could play games and learn programming in BASIC. Offices replaced typewriters and calculators with PCs, transforming the pace of daily work. Small businesses discovered that a single computer could handle tasks that had once required entire departments. The culture of computing was changing. It was no longer about booking time on a single machine shared by many. It was about ownership and personal interaction, the feeling that the machine belonged to you. But as soon as these computers spread, a new question emerged. What if they could connect with each other? What if, instead of being isolated tools, they could form links across distance? The answer came through the modem, short for modulator-demodulator. A modem translated the digital signals of a computer into sounds that could travel across ordinary telephone lines and then back again into data at the other end. When two modems called each other, they seemed to sing, a rising chorus of chirps, hisses, and squeals. To human ears, it was harsh, but to the machines, it was a greeting, a negotiation, a handshake. Once the tones aligned, the connection was made. Information could flow. At first, these connections were slow. 300 bits per second, then 1200, then 2400. Text trickled onto screens, line by line. Images, when they appeared at all, loaded painfully slowly, but for those who heard that sound, the song of the modem, it was magical. The telephone network had been transformed into a data network.
From living rooms and bedrooms, ordinary people could now connect to distant machines. The first communities to emerge were bulletin board systems, or BBSs. A BBS was often run by a hobbyist with a spare PC, a modem, and a phone line. Other users could dial in, one at a time, and interact with the system. They could post messages, download files, or join discussions. It was a digital corkboard, a community notice board, open to anyone who knew the number to dial. Each BBS had its own personality, shaped by the operator, known as the sysop. Some focused on games, some on local news, others on programming tips. Small communities began to grow in these spaces. Friendships were formed, debates unfolded, ideas spread. In many ways, they were the first social networks. As PCs continued to spread, larger commercial services appeared. CompuServe was one of the first, followed by Prodigy, America Online, and others. These services offered far more than a local bulletin board. They provided email, news, stock quotes, shopping catalogs, and forums for discussion. Instead of dialing into a single hobbyist system, families could now connect to vast platforms designed for the general public. America Online, or AOL, became especially famous. Its software arrived in mailboxes across the country on shiny CDs, promising hours of free access. Millions of families logged on for the first time, listening to the squeal of the modem, waiting for the cheerful message, "You've got mail." For many, that moment, simple, almost quaint, was their very first step into the online world. The sound of dial-up became iconic, harsh, mechanical, yet oddly comforting. Each connection meant possibility, a doorway opening to something larger than the room you sat in. Connections were slow, downloads took hours, phone lines were tied up, frustrating family members waiting for calls. Yet the limitations hardly mattered. What mattered was the feeling, the thrill of reaching beyond your home into a wider world. By the late 1980s, PCs and modems planted the seeds of an entirely new culture. Independent networks linked neighborhoods and towns. Commercial services connected millions of users to news, email, and communities. And meanwhile, universities and research institutions continued to expand the Internet, powered by TCP/IP. A convergence was approaching. The institutional world of ARPANET and the personal world of PCs and modems were beginning to overlap. Soon, the boundaries between them would blur. Looking back, the era of personal computers and modems introduced more than just new technology. It introduced a way of living. Email became a daily habit, moving from laboratories into homes. Discussion forums foreshadowed the message boards and social networks to come. File downloads anticipated modern software distribution and media sharing. Usernames and passwords became part of everyday life. Most of all, it showed that networks were not just possible, they were desirable. People wanted them. They wanted to connect, to share, to communicate, not just for work, but for life. From laboratories to living rooms, from institutions to kitchens and bedrooms, the network was becoming part of daily existence. And soon, another leap was waiting, not just bulletin boards or online services, but a new idea altogether. A worldwide web, woven of links, open to anyone. The Internet was preparing to step on to the global stage.
By the late 1980s, the Internet was already alive. It linked universities, research centers, and government agencies across continents. Scientists passed files through FTP, logged in to remote machines with Telnet, and kept up with colleagues through email and Usenet groups. For those inside the network, it was indispensable. But for most of the world, the Internet was still hidden, an obscure system for specialists, shrouded in commands, numbers, and technical jargon. To ordinary people, it meant nothing. Addresses were long strings of digits. Software required cryptic commands. Even for those who could access it, the experience was dry and fragmented. The Internet needed something more, a way to make its information not just accessible, but navigable. This challenge came into focus at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research. There, thousands of physicists worked together on experiments of unprecedented complexity. They came from across the globe, bringing their own computers and their own systems for storing information. Some used mainframes, others used mini-computers or PCs. Their data lived in incompatible formats, scattered across networks. For a researcher arriving at CERN, finding the information they needed could mean chasing leads from office to office, across departments, and through piles of documents. Tim Berners-Lee, a British scientist working at CERN, saw the frustration firsthand. And in 1989, he began to imagine a solution. He envisioned a system where documents could be linked directly to one another, where one piece of information could point seamlessly to another, regardless of the machine or format. Instead of wandering from building to building, researchers could wander through information itself, following connections as naturally as one might follow a trail of thought. In March of that year, he submitted a proposal titled Information Management, a proposal. Modest in tone, but revolutionary in content. He called his vision the World Wide Web. The web built on ideas that had been germinating for decades. In 1945, engineer Vannevar Bush had imagined a machine called the Mimics, a device that would allow scholars to link knowledge together, following associative trails of thought. In the 1960s, Ted Nelson coined the term hypertext, envisioning vast libraries of interconnected documents. Berners-Lee took these earlier dreams and married them to the power of the Internet. He created three essential components: hypertext markup language, HTML, a simple coding system for creating linked documents; hypertext transfer protocol, HTTP, a set of rules that allowed computers to request and serve those documents; and uniform resource locators, URLs, the standardized addresses that could point to any resource anywhere on the network. With these, the pieces fell into place. In 1990, Berners-Lee built the first web browser and the first web server. The very first website went live at CERN in 1991. Its content was humble, a simple explanation of what the web was and how to use it. But it was the beginning of something extraordinary. At first, the web spread slowly, mostly among scientists. But in 1993,
everything changed. At the National Center for Supercomputing Applications in Illinois, Mark Andreessen and his team released Mosaic, the first browser designed for the general public. Unlike earlier tools, Mosaic could display images alongside text, all within a single window. For the first time, the web was not just functional, it was visual. This shift cannot be overstated. Suddenly, the internet was no longer just lines of code on a terminal screen. It was pages, pictures, and links that anyone could click. Mosaic spread like wildfire through universities and eventually into homes, downloaded by curious newcomers eager to explore this new space. Mosaic's success inspired its creators to form a company. In 1994, they launched Netscape Communications and soon after released Netscape Navigator. Sleeker and faster than Mosaic, Navigator became the gateway for millions of people discovering the web for the first time. For a brief moment, Netscape was the face of the internet itself. Another crucial decision fueled this growth. CERN, rather than keeping control of the web, chose to make it open and free. No fees, no licenses. Anyone, anywhere in the world, could build a website and join. That openness became the secret of the web's explosive growth. Anyone with curiosity, a computer, and a modem could become a publisher to the world. By the mid-1990s, the web had escaped its scientific origins. Newspapers launched online editions. Businesses rushed to create websites. Universities shared their research. Hobbyists built personal pages about music, pets, or local clubs. The phrase "surfing the web" entered the culture. For millions of newcomers, the experience was almost magical. You sat in front of a glowing screen, clicked on a link, and were transported instantly to a different place, a different voice, a different perspective. Geography seemed to dissolve. The world itself felt smaller. The World Wide Web was not just another tool layered on top of the internet. It was a new way of thinking about information. It made the network feel like a place, a vast library where every book could point to another, a tapestry of knowledge woven from countless threads. And it made the internet human. Names replaced numbers, clicks replaced commands, and ordinary people could finally explore. From a modest proposal in 1989 to the first website in 1991, to Mosaic in 1993 and Netscape in 1994, the web had grown with astonishing speed. Within just a few years, it transformed the internet from a hidden resource into a global phenomenon. And with that transformation came something else, a rush of energy, of investment, and of ambition. The world began to believe that the web was not just a tool, but a frontier, a place where fortunes could be made and where the future itself would be built. And with this, the dot-com era was about to begin.
By the mid-1990s, the World Wide Web was no longer an experiment. It was spreading quickly, far beyond the walls of laboratories and universities. In just a few short years, what had begun as a proposal on Tim Berners-Lee's desk at CERN had grown into a phenomenon sweeping across the globe. And unlike the quiet growth of ARPANET or TCP/IP, the rise of the web was not invisible. It was sudden. It was public. It was cultural. For the first time, ordinary people were logging on, exploring websites, and beginning to experience the internet as part of their daily lives. The technology behind the web was simple on the surface, but profound in its consequences. At its heart was HTML, Hypertext Markup Language. It was not a programming language in the traditional sense. It was a way of describing how information should be displayed. With just a few lines of code, anyone could create a page with headings, paragraphs, and links. Links were the true magic. A simple tag in HTML could connect one page to another, creating a web of navigation that made the internet feel alive. With every link clicked, users felt the thrill of moving from one corner of the world to another instantly. Alongside HTML was HTTP, Hypertext Transport Protocol. This was the set of rules that allowed browsers and servers to talk to one another. When you typed a URL and pressed Enter, your browser sent an HTTP request to a server asking for the page. The server responded, sending the HTML code back. The browser read it, interpreted it, and displayed it for you to see. And URLs, Uniform Resource Locators, gave every page an address. Just as every home has a street address, every resource on the web had its unique locator. Together, these three technologies made the web possible. At first, the web was filled with simple text pages, but quickly, browsers added more features. Mosaic introduced images. Netscape Navigator made browsing faster and more reliable. By the mid-1990s, websites had graphics, layouts, and even early interactive elements. Designers experimented with tables, frames, and colorful backgrounds. What had been a simple way to share documents was evolving into a new medium entirely. This technical foundation, HTML, HTTP, and URLs, combined with the spread of faster computers and dial-up modems to create the conditions for something extraordinary: the commercialization of the web. America Online, better known as AOL, became the gateway for millions of newcomers. Its software, distributed on floppy disks and later CDs, arrived in homes across the United States. Bright advertisements promised free hours of online access. Families installed the software, connected their modems, and waited through the chorus of squeals and clicks until they were greeted with the words, "You've got mail." For many, that phrase became their first experience of the internet. AOL bundled everything into one package: email, chat rooms, news, games, and a simple gateway to the web itself. It made going online feel approachable, even friendly. Other commercial services like CompuServe and Prodigy also connected users to email and online communities. But AOL's aggressive marketing and user-friendly interface gave it dominance in the United States during the 1990s. By the end of the decade, it had tens of millions of subscribers. But while AOL was introducing families to the internet, another revolution was unfolding. Entrepreneurs began to realize that the web was not just a space for information, but a space for business. One of the first and most influential was Amazon. Founded in 1994 by Jeff Bezos, Amazon began as an online bookstore. The idea seemed almost absurd at the time. Why would anyone order books through a computer, waiting days for them to arrive, when they could simply walk into a store? But Bezos saw the potential. A physical bookstore was limited by shelf space. An online store could, in theory, carry every book in print. And with a simple website,
A customer could browse, search, and purchase without leaving home. The technology behind Amazon was modest: HTML pages, CGI scripts for processing orders, and databases that tracked inventory. But its impact was enormous. Amazon proved that the web could be more than a curiosity. It could be a platform for commerce. At almost the same time, another company was born: eBay. Founded in 1995 by Pierre Omidyar, eBay began as a simple idea: an online auction site where people could buy and sell directly to one another. Its first sale was a broken laser pointer, purchased by a collector for a few dollars. From that small beginning, eBay grew into a global marketplace. The brilliance of eBay was not in flashy technology, but in trust. It created a feedback system where buyers and sellers rated each other. This built confidence in a space where people were sending money to strangers they had never met. eBay became the digital equivalent of a flea market, a bazaar, and an auction house all at once. It showed that the web could create not only new ways of doing business, but new communities of commerce. Amazon and eBay were pioneers, but they were not alone. Countless startups launched during these years, each hoping to carve out a piece of the new frontier. Some focused on selling goods, others on providing services. Venture capital flowed into Silicon Valley and beyond, fueling dreams of fortune built on websites. Traditional companies also began to adapt. Newspapers launched online editions. Banks experimented with online banking. Travel agencies opened websites where customers could book flights. Retailers rushed to establish an online presence. The phrase .com entered the language, attached to every new business hoping to stake its claim in cyberspace. The web also changed how people communicated. Email, once the tool of scientists, became a daily habit for millions. Companies relied on it for business. Families used it to stay in touch. Mailing lists expanded into online forums. Instant messaging services like ICQ launched in 1996, and AOL Instant Messenger, launched a year later, gave people real-time conversation. The web was becoming social, not just informational. And then there were the search engines. In the early days of the web, finding information meant clicking from link to link or consulting long lists of sites. Directories like Yahoo attempted to organize the growing chaos, categorizing websites by topic. But as the web exploded in size, directories became inadequate. Search engines like Lycos, AltaVista, and Excite appeared, using automated programs called crawlers to index the web. For the first time, users could type a word and find relevant pages instantly. It transformed the web from a maze of pages into a searchable universe. And in 1998, a small startup called Google would take this concept and perfect it, creating a search engine that would change the way humanity accessed knowledge. Behind the scenes, the technologies of the web were evolving rapidly. HTML, once simple, gained new tags and capabilities. JavaScript was introduced in 1995, allowing interactive features within pages. Java applets promised small programs that could run directly in the browser. Plugins brought audio and video into the mix. Web servers became more sophisticated. Apache, an open-source server software, rose to prominence.
What began as static pages of text was turning into dynamic, interactive applications. The web was no longer just for reading, it was for doing. By the late 1990s, the scale of growth was staggering. In 1993, there had been fewer than 1,000 websites. By 1996, there were hundreds of thousands. And by the year 1999, the number of websites online reached the tens of millions, showing the exponential growth of the internet during the time. Traffic doubled and doubled again. Investors poured billions into startups. Television ads encouraged viewers to visit us on the web. Billboards carried URLs. Commercials ended with .com slogans. The internet was no longer a hidden tool of scientists. It was a cultural phenomenon. And yet, beneath the excitement, the foundations were fragile. Many .com companies had little more than a website and an idea. They burned through capital without building sustainable businesses. For every Amazon or eBay that endured, dozens of others collapsed. Pets.com, Webvan, Cosmo, and countless more. But in those years of frenzy, something important happened. The infrastructure was laid. Fiber optic cables were stretched across continents. Data centers multiplied. Web servers scaled. And millions of people, for the first time, became comfortable living part of their lives online. Looking back, the commercialization of the web in the 1990s was more than a business story. It was a cultural shift. It transformed how people bought, sold, learned, and communicated. It changed how companies operated, how media was consumed, how knowledge was spread. From AOL's chat rooms to Amazon's bookstore, from eBay's auctions to Yahoo's directories, from Netscape's browser to Google search, the web had become the most important platform of its time. And though the dot-com bubble would burst in the early 2000s, leaving behind wreckage and disillusionment, the foundation remained. The habits persisted. The infrastructure endured. The companies that survived grew stronger. The web had entered daily life, and there was no turning back. By the mid-1990s, the World Wide Web had transformed from a quiet experiment into a global sensation. Websites were multiplying at a staggering rate. Every month brought new services, new communities, and new companies. The energy was electric, and the sense of possibility seemed endless. Investors, entrepreneurs, and dreamers all rushed to stake their claims in the digital frontier. The formula felt simple. Register a domain, build a website, and suddenly you had a company. Venture capitalists poured billions into startups with little more than an idea and a catchy name. The phrase .com became synonymous with innovation and wealth. In offices across Silicon Valley, and increasingly across the world, new companies were born every day. Many focused on retail, hoping to replicate Amazon's success. Some tried to sell groceries online. Others promised same-day delivery of anything you could imagine. Startups like Pets.com became famous not for their profits, which were non-existent, but for their mascots and flashy Super Bowl ads. For a time, it seemed as though anything was possible. Websites drew millions of visitors, even if they had no clear plan for making money. The priority was growth, not sustainability.
Investors didn't want slow, steady businesses. They wanted explosive expansion. They wanted to be part of the next Amazon, the next eBay. The numbers were dazzling. Between 1995 and 2000, the NASDAQ index, home to many technology companies, rose fivefold. Companies went public with initial public offerings that skyrocketed on the first day. One of the most famous was Netscape, which went public in 1995. Its stock price doubled almost immediately, signaling to Wall Street that the internet was more than a curiosity, it was the future. IPO fever spread quickly. Young startups rushed to go public, many without profits or even revenue. Overnight millionaires were created as stock options turned paper wealth into real fortunes. The culture of the time was distinct. Startups flaunted their unconventional offices, beanbags, scooters, and free cafeterias. Billboards along highways advertised .com brands. Television commercials promoted websites instead of products. Even mainstream culture absorbed the excitement. Movies and television shows featured going online as something modern, futuristic, and almost glamorous. The internet was no longer just technology, it was a cultural symbol. The late 1990s also brought new ways to use the web. Napster, launched in 1999, let users share music files directly with one another. For the first time, millions of people could download songs instantly, bypassing record stores and record labels. The music industry was shaken. Lawsuits flew, and the concept of digital distribution was thrust into the spotlight. While Napster itself was shut down, its impact was permanent. The web was proving it could transform not just business, but entire industries. At the same time, broadband connections began to replace dial-up. No longer did users have to endure the slow handshake of a modem or worry about tying up the family phone line. Broadband meant speed and permanence. Connections were always on. Pages loaded faster. Images, video, and audio became practical. The idea of the web as a multimedia platform began to feel real. But as the excitement grew, so too did the risks. By 2000, skepticism was rising. Analysts began to ask hard questions. How would these companies make money? Were their business models sustainable? The answers were often vague, filled with buzzwords, but little substance. The crash came swiftly. Stock prices plummeted. Companies once valued in the billions collapsed into bankruptcy. Pets.com closed, its sock puppet mascot remembered as a symbol of the era's excess. Webvan, which had promised grocery delivery to millions, folded under the weight of its logistics costs. Countless smaller .coms disappeared overnight. The crash was painful. Thousands lost their jobs. Fortunes evaporated. Confidence in the internet itself wavered. In early 2000, AOL announced a merger with Time Warner, the largest in U.S. history, valued at more than $160 billion. At the time, it seemed to prove that the internet had conquered traditional media. But within a few years, the deal was seen as one of the most disastrous mergers ever, a victim of the bursting bubble and mismatched expectations. And yet, even in the collapse, the internet endured. Beneath the speculation, real progress had been made. Fiber optic cables had been laid across continents. Data centers had been built. Software had matured. Millions of households had learned to live part of their lives online. The survivors grew stronger. Amazon refined its operations, expanded its product lines, and became the store of everything. eBay continued to thrive, linking buyers and sellers across the globe. And in 1998, a small startup named Google emerged, creating a search engine so effective that it soon became the dominant gateway to the web. The dot-com boom was not just a financial bubble, it was a cultural shift. It introduced millions of people to the web, created habits that would never fade, and built infrastructure that still powers the internet today. It was messy, exuberant, and unsustainable, but it was transformative. When the dust settled in the early 2000s, the frenzy was gone. The easy money had vanished, but the web itself remained stronger than before. The crash had cleared the field, leaving behind the companies and technologies that truly worked. The internet had entered its adolescence. The next wave of social networks, Web 2.0, and a more interactive, participatory internet was just over the horizon. And so our journey comes to a close. We began in a world without screens, a slower world where messages traveled on paper and knowledge waited patiently in libraries. We stepped into rooms filled with mainframes, massive machines glowing with vacuum tubes, tended by teams of engineers and programmers. We saw how those machines, though powerful, were isolated, islands of calculation with no bridges between them. Then we followed the spark of connection. ARPANET, born in the tense years of the Cold War, showed that computers could talk across distance. With packet switching, fragile lines of communication became resilient webs. We listened as a student typed "log in" and watched as the system crashed after 2 letters, leaving the internet's very first message a simple "LO," an accidental greeting that became in its own way a hello to the future. From there, we witnessed the creation of a common language. Vinton Cerf and Con gave us TCP/IP, the protocols that allowed networks of every shape to speak to one another. And on January 1st, 1983, the world changed as ARPANET and all its hosts adopted this shared language. That moment was the true birth of the internet, not just one network, but a network of networks. We saw how the internet became human-friendly with the invention of DNS. Numbers gave way to names. Long strings of digits became familiar addresses like MIT.edu and Stanford.edu. Suddenly, the growing network felt less like a machine and more like a place that people could explore. We walked through the early years of tools, email, FTP, Telnet, and Usenet. Each one added a new dimension, a way to communicate instantly, a way to share files across distance, a way to log into machines half a continent away, a way to form communities around conversation. With each tool, the internet became less about machines and more about people. Then came the personal computer. From bedrooms and classrooms, people connected their PCs through the sound of modems, dialing into bulletin boards and online services. Communities sprouted on BBS systems. Families logged into AOL, greeted by the iconic words, "You've got mail." What had begun as a tool for scientists was becoming part of everyday life. The squeal of dial-up was more than noise, it was the sound of connection. And then, in a quiet office at CERN, Tim Berners-Lee proposed a new way of linking information. HTML, HTTP, and URLs became the foundation of the World Wide Web. With Mosaic and later Netscape, the web spread beyond universities to homes, businesses, and eventually the entire world. For the first time, the internet was navigable by anyone. No commands, no codes, just a browser and a mouse. We watched as the web went commercial. Amazon began as a bookstore, eBay as an auction house. AOL became the front door for millions of newcomers. Yahoo tried to catalog the chaos. Google redefined how we searched. By the late 1990s, the web was a global frontier. Investors poured billions into startups. Some soared, many collapsed. And when the bubble burst in the early 2000s, trillions of dollars vanished overnight. But from the wreckage, the survivors endured, stronger, leaner, and ready to define the internet for decades to come. All of these steps, from ENIAC's glowing tubes to Amazon's digital bookstore, from LO on ARPANET to the burst of the dot-com bubble, are all part of the same story, a story of connection, a story of people searching for faster ways to share, to collaborate, to communicate. The internet did not appear fully formed. It was not built by one genius in one moment. It was the work of thousands, scientists, engineers, students, entrepreneurs, and dreamers. Each added a piece, each left a mark, and together they built a network that has changed how humanity lives, learns, and dreams. As you listen to this history, you may feel the weight of how far we have come in just a few decades. From paper letters and punch cards to a web of billions of voices, carrying messages across the globe in the blink of an eye. The internet today is vast, sometimes overwhelming, but at its heart, it remains what it was in those early days, a way for people to reach one another. And now we look forward. The web has already reshaped the world once. It will continue to evolve in ways we can only imagine. But no matter what comes next, the history we have walked through tonight will always remain its foundation. Before we close, I want to thank you for spending your time here listening to this story. This video is part of a series, a growing library of calm, thoughtful journeys into the histories of technology, science, and the world around us. If you found yourself learning something new, or if you simply enjoyed the gentle pace of this telling, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Subscribing helps you stay connected to future stories, and it tells YouTube that this kind of content matters to you. If you liked this video, a simple click on the like button helps others discover it too. And if you have thoughts, memories of the early internet, or suggestions for what stories you'd like to hear next, leave them in the comments. I read them, and they help guide where this series will go. And when you are ready for more, there are other videos waiting here for you. each one a quiet exploration, told in the same calm voice, meant to inform, to relax, and to accompany you as you drift toward rest. So for now, take a breath. Feel your body sink a little deeper into comfort. The story of the Internet's beginnings has reached its pause, but the journey continues in history and here on this channel. Thank you for listening, and good night.